And we have, as of today, we have more people working in the United States than at any time in the history of our country. To me, it's one of my favorite stats. But we have more people today working in the United States than at any time in the history. And this is with the Iran conflict. That'll end soon, very soon. And when it ends, your gasoline prices will go down lower than they were before.
Iran may have discovered that its most powerful weapon against the West is not necessarily missiles or drones, but the ability to trigger an economic shock capable of destabilizing global markets and energy supplies at the same time. Some analysts now believe Iran's most dangerous leverage may lie in creating a global economic and energy crisis so severe that even the world's biggest powers struggle to absorb the financial consequences. As tensions continue to escalate around the Strait of Hormuz, observers are increasingly questioning whether Iran is testing not just military red lines, but also the world's confidence in America's ability to maintain global stability. Despite repeated assurances and confident messaging from Donald Trump and U.S. officials, governments and financial markets around the world are now actively preparing for a potentially far more dangerous economic fallout scenario. Warnings are growing that a prolonged closure or disruption of the Strait of Hormuz could trigger a global recession severe enough to draw comparisons with the devastating financial meltdown that shook the world economy in 2008. According to Bloomberg, the global economy could face a crisis comparable to the 2008 financial meltdown if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for a prolonged period amid the escalating Iran conflict and energy market disruption. Bloomberg also reported that any extended closure or severe disruption in the Strait of Hormuz could push the world closer toward a major global recession by severely damaging trade flows, oil supplies, and financial stability. Rapidan Energy has further warned that the growing Hormuz crisis carries the potential to trigger a global economic meltdown similar in scale and shock impact to the devastating financial crisis that erupted in 2008. The Rapidan Energy analyst told Bloomberg that the current macro setup is less extreme than the 1970s or 2007-08. But that relatively stronger starting point doesn't neutralize the risk that continued oil price spikes would exacerbate financial and macroeconomic vulnerabilities. We are expecting an average oil demand reduction of 2.6 million barrels a day and the spot market price for benchmark Brent crude peaking near $130 a barrel over the summer. According to the International Monetary Fund, the global economy fell into its deepest and most damaging recession since the Great Depression in the aftermath of the massive 2008 financial crisis that shook markets worldwide. The International Labour Organization reported that the 2008 financial meltdown caused global unemployment to surge dramatically, with nearly 34 million more people losing jobs across economies already struggling with recession and instability. The collapse of investment giant Lehman Brothers in 2008 triggered a worldwide panic across the banking and credit system, according to the U.S. Federal Reserve, accelerating fears of a total financial breakdown. In response to the rapidly spreading crisis, the United States government approved a massive $700 billion TARP bailout package aimed at preventing major banks and financial institutions from collapsing entirely. The World Trade Organization stated that global trade suffered its sharpest decline since the Second World War after the 2008 crisis disrupted supply chains, investments, consumer demand, and international commerce. Central banks around the world were ultimately forced to slash interest rates to near zero levels in an emergency effort to stabilize collapsing economies and restore confidence after the 2008 financial meltdown. According to assessments referenced by the World Bank, the 2008 financial crisis went on to trigger years of slow economic growth, harsh austerity measures, and rising public anger across many parts of the world. According to multiple reports examining the escalating Iran crisis, worst-case scenarios now fear that the strategically vital Strait of Hormuz could remain closed or severely disrupted until August, intensifying pressure on the global economy and energy markets. Iran's parliament is preparing a new legal framework intended to give authorities the power to block what Tehran would label enemy ships from transiting the Strait of Hormuz, a move that would formalize restrictions on maritime traffic under the guise of national security. According to Iran International on May 19th, the proposed framework will require approval by the Iranian parliament, meaning the measure must pass formal legislative steps before it can become enforceable policy. Lawmaker Ebrahim Rizai, a member of the parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, revealed details of the proposal, signaling that Tehran is moving the idea from strategic discussion into the legislative process. Ebrahim Rizai said, and I quote, "The Americans must either submit to diplomacy and our conditions, or to the power of our missiles. Any new strikes on Iran would face a stronger response and that Tehran was prepared for all scenarios." Unquote. Remember, Iran blocked the Strait of Hormuz once the war began on February 28, an early and decisive move that immediately disrupted global shipping and set the stage for a prolonged maritime standoff. The United States then launched its own blockade of Hormuz after efforts to break Iran's chokehold by force failed, a reciprocal measure intended to deny Tehran freedom of movement while trying to keep critical sea lanes open for allied commerce. The United States has extended a sanctions waiver allowing trade in Russian seaborne oil for another 30 days. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced the waiver extension on X on May 18. Washington had earlier allowed the Russian oil sanctions waiver to lapse before renewing it again. Scott Bessent said, and I quote, U.S. Treasury is issuing a temporary 30-day general license to provide the most vulnerable nations with the ability to temporarily access Russian oil currently stranded at sea. This extension will provide additional flexibility, and we will work with these nations to provide specific licenses as needed. This general license will help stabilize the physical crude market and ensure oil reaches the most energy-vulnerable countries. It will also help reroute existing supply to countries most in need by reducing China's ability to stockpile discounted oil. The move follows requests from several countries seeking more time to continue oil purchases. The waiver allows temporary access to Russian oil stranded on tankers despite existing U.S. sanctions. Washington introduced the exemption after Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz during the regional war. Officials said the move aims to ease global oil supply concerns and stabilize rising energy prices. The exemption was first introduced in March to reduce oil supply disruptions triggered by tensions involving Iran. Despite the waiver extension, gasoline prices across the United States have remained elevated amid market instability. Hormuz is currently seeing a dual blockade by both U.S. and Iranian navies, a dangerous standoff that has turned the strait into a contested military corridor and severely complicated commercial transit plans. The Strait of Hormuz, located off the coast of Iran, is a vital waterway in the Middle East and one of the most important maritime arteries for global energy and trade flows. The Hormuz Strait is a critical choke point and is approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, a narrowness that magnifies its strategic vulnerability and the consequences of any disruption. At around 20 million barrels per day, Hormuz handled roughly one-fifth of global oil consumption before the war, underscoring how central the passage was to worldwide energy supply chains. The strait also handled about 20% to 25% of the world's liquefied natural gas, much of which originated in Qatar and transited the waterway to reach global buyers. More than 80% of the oil passing through the Hormuz Strait was destined for Asian markets, highlighting the region's heavy dependence on the route for its energy imports. Energy prices remain volatile due to the closure and blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, with markets reacting to supply risks, shipping delays, and uncertainty over how long disruptions will last.